Work offshore, 14 days on, 14 days off, sometimes longer if weather delays the rotation or the relief crew gets held up in transit. I've done it for 11 years. You get used to the rhythm of it. 2 weeks where the platform is your whole world. Then 2 weeks where you try to remember how to sleep in a bed that doesn't vibrate, in a room that doesn't smell like diesel and salt water. My house in Slidell, just northeast of New Orleans across the lake, was supposed to be the part of my life that stayed still while everything else moved. I bought it 6 years ago, right after my divorce was finalized. Nothing fancy. A 3-bedroom ranch on a quiet street, the kind of neighborhood where people put American flags out on holidays and actually mow their lawns. I paid $218,000 for it. I put 11% down and signed papers that made my hand cramp. It was mine. That mattered more than I expected it to. Living alone in a house that size when you're only there half the time feels a little strange at first. The first few months I'd come home and the whole place would have this stillness to it, like it had been holding its breath. I'd open windows, run the faucets, turn on the TV just to have noise. After a while, it stopped feeling strange and started feeling like mine in a deeper way. Nobody else's dishes in the sink. Nobody else's mail on the counter. Nobody else's schedule dictating when the lights went on or off. I kept to myself mostly. I knew my neighbors well enough to wave, knew the older couple 2 doors down by first name because they'd helped me drag a broken water heater to the curb once, but I wasn't close with anyone on the block. Offshore guys tend to compartmentalize. You have your platform life and your home life, and they don't overlap much. That was fine by me. The first sign that something was wrong came from my electric bill. I get my utility statements emailed to me. I check them when I'm back on shore, usually in the first day or two. I've been rotating home in early March and I pulled up my account while I was eating breakfast. The February bill was $214. I remember thinking that seemed high for a house nobody was in for 2 weeks, but February in Louisiana can be cold and I'd left the heat set to 62. I made a mental note and didn't think much of it. The March bill was $289. That one I actually looked at twice. I'd been home maybe 10 days that month total. I wasn't running the dryer constantly or leaving every light burning. I went to the utility company's website and looked at the usage breakdown. The consumption numbers for the days I knew I'd been offshore were nearly as high as the days I was home. That didn't make sense. I figured maybe the meter was glitching or there was something running I didn't know about, old refrigerator compressor, HVAC issue. I made another mental note, this one slightly more serious, and told myself I'd call an HVAC tech when I had time. I didn't call the HVAC tech. I went back offshore. When I got home in April, I noticed the smell first. It's hard to describe exactly. My house has its own smell. A little bit of the candles I burn, a little bit of the cedar closet in the hallway, a faint trace of whatever cleaning product I use on the floors. I know it the way you know the smell of your own car. When I walked in that April evening, there was something layered underneath the familiar smell. Something like takeout food, slightly sweet, slightly greasy, the kind of smell that takes a few days to build up in a space. I stood in the entryway for a second. I told myself it was probably just residue from before I left. Maybe I'd thrown something out late and the kitchen trash had been close to full. I put my bag down and went to the kitchen. The trash can was empty. I had emptied it before I left. I know I had because I always do. I opened the refrigerator out of habit and stopped. On the top shelf where I keep my leftovers and drinks, there was a 6-pack of a beer I don't buy, not a brand I recognized. Next to it, a plastic deli container with a paper label from a grocery store in Metairie. I shop at the Rouses in Slidell, not a store in Metairie. There was also half a rotisserie chicken still in the store bag, the sell-by date 3 days earlier. I closed the refrigerator. I stood in my kitchen for a long moment and thought about what I was looking at. The first thing my brain did was reach for a reasonable explanation. Maybe someone had a spare key I'd forgotten about. My ex-wife, my brother who lives in Baton Rouge and sometimes passes through. But my ex-wife and I hadn't spoken in 2 years, and she would never. My brother would have texted me, and neither of them would have left groceries and said nothing. I walked through the rest of the house slowly. The living room looked normal at first, but then I noticed the couch had been moved. Not dramatically, maybe 8 inches, angled slightly toward the TV. The end table had been shifted. The throw blanket that I keep folded on the arm of the chair was bunched up like someone had used it and dropped it back vaguely into place. In the hallway bathroom, the one I never use, I always use the master, there was a damp hand towel hanging on the rack. My hand towels are in the master bathroom. This one was gray, folded in thirds the way I don't fold them. I stood in that hallway bathroom for a long time. Then I checked the bedrooms. The 2 spare rooms looked untouched. But in the second one, the one I use as a storage room, I noticed the closet door was slightly open. I always keep it closed. I have a thing about closed doors. I don't know why. I've just always been like that. Inside the closet, pushed against the back wall behind a box of old tax files, there was a folded sleeping bag. Dark green, fairly new-looking. It was not mine. I had been offshore for 12 days. Someone had been in my house. I called the Slidell PD non-emergency line that night. The officer who came out was polite and thorough. He looked at the groceries, the towel, the sleeping bag. He took notes. And then he said what I was not ready to hear, which was that without evidence of forced entry or an explicit threat, there wasn't a lot they could immediately do. My locks hadn't been broken. My windows were intact. Whoever had been there had gotten in with a key. He asked me who had keys to my house. I told him, just me. I'd had the locks changed when I bought the place as a matter of standard practice. I hadn't given copies to anyone. He wrote everything down and told me to file a formal report, which I did. He also suggested I look into getting security cameras if I didn't already have them, and said that if I saw anyone on the property, I should call 911 immediately rather than confront them. I didn't sleep much that night. I lay in my own bed in my own house and stared at the ceiling and thought about someone sleeping in my spare closet on a sleeping bag while my lights were off and my property was sitting there quiet. The idea of it was worse than a break-in somehow. A break-in is violent and quick and then it's over. This felt like something that had been going on for a while. Quietly, calmly. Like someone had decided my absence was a resource and just started using it. I ordered 4 cameras the next morning, 2 exterior, 2 interior, covering the front door, the back door, the living room, and the hallway. They were connected to an app on my phone. I had them installed by the end of the week before I went back offshore. I also bought a combination lockbox and put a secondary deadbolt on the door, the kind that requires a physical key from both sides. If someone had a copy of my old key, they'd still have access to the main lock, but the secondary deadbolt would stop them. I made sure the cameras were recording and live viewable from the platform. Then I went back to work. 9 days later, sitting in the break room at 11 in the morning platform time, I opened the camera app on my phone and watched a white Kia pull into my driveway. I watched a woman I didn't recognize get out of the driver's seat with a reusable grocery bag in each hand. She walked to my front door, used a key on the main lock, and tried the door. The secondary deadbolt held. I watched her try the key twice more, then take out her phone and make a call. She stood there on my front porch for about 4 minutes, on the phone, looking at my door. And then she got back in the Kia and left. I called the Slidell PD again and told them what I had. A timestamp, a partial license plate I'd been able to freeze frame, a recording of a woman with a key to my house who didn't live there. The detective I spoke to this time took it more seriously. He told me to send the footage and said they'd look into the plate. I also called my brother that same day and walked him through what was happening. He's a methodical person, the kind who thinks before he talks, and he listened to the whole thing before he said anything. Then he said, "You need to figure out how she got the key. Because if you never made a copy, someone made one for her, and that someone had access to your house at some point. He was right. The key wasn't the end of the problem. The key was a symptom. I went back through everything I could think of. Who had been in my house over the past 2 years with enough time and opportunity to take my keys somewhere and copy it and return it before I noticed? I'd had a plumber in about 18 months ago for a burst pipe under the kitchen sink, an electrician before that to update the panel, a friend from offshore, a guy I'd worked rotations with for 3 years. I'll call him the coworker, had stayed on my couch for a long weekend about 2 years back when he was passing through on his way to visit family in Mississippi. He and I got along well. I'd given him a key so he could come and go while I ran errands that weekend. I hadn't thought about that in 2 years. When the detective called me back 4 days later, he told me the Kia was registered to a woman in New Orleans East and that she had, when contacted, initially denied knowing anything about a house in Slidell. But the footage was clear. She had a key. She had used it. Eventually, under further questioning, she gave a name. The name she gave was my coworker's. He had been listing my house on a vacation rental platform under a fake listing. Short-term stays, mostly weekends, listed as a cozy ranch home in quiet Slidell neighborhood, close to I-10 and the lake. He had a copy of my key from that weekend 2 years ago. He knew my rotation schedule because we'd worked the same platform. He knew exactly when I'd be offshore. For at least 7 months, based on what investigators eventually pieced together, he had been renting my house to strangers while I was at sea. The woman in the Kia was a guest who had a confirmed reservation for that weekend. She paid $140 a night for 3 nights. She hadn't known the house wasn't legitimately listed. She'd booked through what looked like a normal rental platform, gotten confirmation, and shown up with groceries expecting to stay the weekend. When investigators looked at the rental account history, they found he had collected somewhere between $11,000 and $14,000 over those 7 months. He had used photographs of my living room, my backyard, my kitchen, my furniture, my pots and pans, my guest towels. He had written a listing description that called it clean, well-maintained, perfect for a relaxing getaway. He had reviews. Guests had stayed in my house and left him 5 stars. I cannot fully explain what it felt like to read that. I sat in my truck in my own driveway and scrolled through the listing on my phone and read strangers' reviews of my own house and felt something that wasn't exactly anger and wasn't exactly violation and was probably both of those things and several others stacked on top of each other. Someone I'd trusted. Someone I'd handed a beer to in my own living room. Someone I'd sat a night shift next to for weeks at a time on a steel platform in the Gulf of Mexico. He had looked at my life, seen the gaps in it, and decided those gaps were his to profit from. The criminal case moved through the system. He was charged with theft by deception and unauthorized use of a movable. Louisiana has specific statutes that cover this kind of thing. His attorney tried to argue that the arrangement had been some kind of informal understanding, that had given him the key and implicitly authorized use of the property. I have never in my life wanted anything to be clearly documented as badly as I wanted that to be clearly disprovable. Fortunately, I had text records going back 2 years. Nothing, not a word, not a suggestion, indicated any kind of arrangement. The key had been given for one specific weekend. That was it. My own attorney filed a civil suit alongside the criminal case. Between the rental income he'd collected, the depreciation on furnishings, and documented damages, we settled for just over $19,000. It took 8 months and cost me in legal fees, but the number we arrived at covered what he'd made and then some. He was convicted on the theft charge. He lost his offshore certification as a result. That's an automatic consequence of certain criminal convictions in that industry. He doesn't work the platforms anymore. I changed the locks the same week I came home to those groceries. I installed the secondary deadbolt. I have 4 cameras. I have a neighbor, the older man 2 doors down, who I now have an actual arrangement with. I pay him $100 a month to walk by my house twice a week while I'm offshore, take any packages inside, let me know if anything looks off. $100 a month is nothing. I don't know why I didn't do it years ago. I still work the same rotation. 14 on, 14 off, give or take. The platform hasn't changed. The gulf hasn't changed. The smell of diesel in the morning when you walk out to the deck hasn't changed. I still come home to a house that's been sitting still without me. But now when I open my front door and step inside, I check the camera log before I check anything else. I look at every timestamp. I look at every face. And then I look at the refrigerator. And if everything in there is exactly what I left behind, I put my bag down and breathe. Some things you have to learn the hard way. I'd rather have learned it differently. But I know my house now in a way I didn't before. Every lock, every angle, every gap. The road takes something from you. It's worth making sure nobody else helps themselves to what's left. I've thought a lot about what made this possible. Not just the logistics of it, the copied key, the rotation schedule, the fake listing, but what made it possible in a deeper sense. And the honest answer is that I made it easy, not because I was careless exactly, but because I trusted without verifying, and I assumed that the stillness I came home to meant everything was fine. Stillness just means quiet. It doesn't mean safe. The coworker didn't become someone who would do this overnight. People don't. What he did took planning. He looked at my schedule. He looked at my house. He looked at the gap between those two things and decided it was an opportunity. That kind of decision doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from a slow erosion of something, a willingness to treat another person's life as raw material. I can be angry about it, and I was, but I also think understanding it is more useful than staying angry. He made a choice that prioritized his own gain over basic decency, over the years we'd worked side by side, over everything that should have made my house off limits. That's on him. The consequences landed on him too. What I had to reckon with was my own part in it. I'd gotten comfortable with assumptions. I assumed that because I'd changed the locks when I bought the place, I'd covered that risk. I assumed that a weekend of trust extended to a man I'd worked alongside meant nothing would come of it. I assumed that if something were wrong, I'd notice. The electric bill was telling me something for 2 months before I listened. The smell in the entryway was telling me something the moment I walked in that April night. I walked past the signals because I wasn't looking for them. There's a version of this story where I come home, see the beer in the refrigerator, and immediately change the locks, call the police, and install cameras within 48 hours. That version cost me less. But I've also had to accept that I wasn't equipped to respond that way before this happened. I didn't have the habits. I didn't have the systems. I'd been putting my head down and working and assuming that effort on one front meant security on all the others. It doesn't. Competence at your job doesn't automatically transfer to every other area of your life. What I came away with, what I actually use now, is simpler than I expected. Check the things that are supposed to stay the same. When something small doesn't add up, don't file it away for later. The capacity to notice and then to act on what you notice instead of rationalizing it away turns out to be one of the most practical skills a person can have. It requires a kind of intellectual honesty that's harder than it sounds because the mind really does want to find the comfortable explanation. And the patience to let the process work. Filing the reports, gathering the footage, going through the attorney, waiting for the civil case to settle. That tested something in me. Every instinct said to escalate, to confront, to make it move faster. Sitting offshore for 14 days knowing what I knew and doing nothing but document was genuinely difficult. But the outcome required that patience. Shortcuts would have closed the door on accountability. My brother said something when I called him from the platform that I've kept with me. He said, the key is a symptom. Find what the key came from. That's good advice for a lot of things, not just a copied house key. Most problems worth solving have a root that isn't the same thing as the surface. The work isn't tracing it back. I still go offshore. I still come home to a quiet house. I still stand in the entryway for a second when I first walk in and let it settle around me. But now I know what I'm listening for.